The evening sky turned deep purple as streetlights flickered on across the quiet neighborhood. Two teenagers were driving home after their high school debate tournament. The brother and sister team had just won first place, and a small trophy sat on the back seat, catching the light every time they passed under a street lamp. David, the older brother, drove carefully, always 5 miles under the speed limit. His sister Amara sat beside him, scrolling through congratulatory messages from their parents. "Dad says he's making his famous celebration pancakes tomorrow," she said with a smile. Their father was someone important in the community, a state senator known for his work on police reform bills. Growing up as the children of one of the few black senators in the state came with certain lessons. Their father had sat them down many times over the years, explaining how to behave if ever stopped by police. "Not because you've done anything wrong," he would say, "but because sometimes people see our skin before they see anything else." David checked his mirrors, slowed at a yellow light, and came to a complete stop. Everything by the book. That's when he noticed the police cruiser that had been following them for the past few blocks. Blue and red lights suddenly flashed in the darkness. "I didn't do anything wrong," David said, his voice steady but his hands beginning to tremble on the steering wheel. "It's okay," Amara whispered, though her heart pounded in her chest. "Remember what Dad taught us." David pulled over carefully, turned off the engine, and placed both hands where they could be seen on the steering wheel. Amara did the same, putting her hands on the dashboard. Two officers approached, one on each side of the car. Their flashlights beamed directly into the teenagers' faces. "License and registration," the officer on the driver's side demanded, his hand resting near his holster. "My license is in my wallet, in my back pocket, sir." "I'm going to reach for it now, very slowly," David explained, his voice calm despite his racing heart. "Why are you driving through this neighborhood?" the second officer asked, shining his light around the car's interior, stopping briefly on the debate trophy. "We're on our way home, officer. We live 3 blocks from here on Pine Street," Amara explained. The first officer examined David's license, his eyebrows raising slightly when he read the last name. Everyone in the state knew that name. "Williams? Any relation to Senator Williams?" the officer asked, his tone shifting slightly. "He's our father, sir," David replied. The officers exchanged glances. Something in their demeanor changed, not softer, but more alert, more careful. "Step out of the vehicle, both of you," the first officer ordered. "May I ask why, sir?" David asked, still polite, still following the script his father had drilled into them. "There's been a report of suspicious activity in the area. You match the description." The teenagers complied, stepping out slowly with their hands visible. Nearby, porch lights began turning on. Neighbors peered through windows and doorways. An older woman across the street stepped onto her porch, phone in hand, watching intently. As the officers began questioning them more aggressively, Amara noticed more neighbors emerging from their homes. Some had phones raised, recording. Others simply stood in silent witness. "Where were you coming from again?" the second officer demanded, circling the car. "The state debate championship at Central High School," Amara explained, pointing to their trophy. "We won first place." The officer ignored her explanation and began searching their car without asking permission. David stood tall, remembering his father's words. "Your dignity is not something anyone can take from you. Stand in your truth." A small crowd had gathered now, not threatening, just present, watching. The neighborhood knew whose children these were. They knew what was happening, and they weren't going to look away. The first officer's radio crackled. He turned away to respond, speaking in low tones. When he turned back, his partner had already pulled out the contents of the glove compartment onto the hood of the car. What no one knew yet was that this moment, this ordinary traffic stop that was anything but ordinary, would spark something unexpected, something that would change their community forever. The tension in the air grew thick as more neighbors stepped out onto their porches and sidewalks. David stood perfectly still beside the car, his debate trophy now sitting on the hood next to the scattered contents of their glove compartment. Amara's hands trembled slightly, but she kept them visible at her sides. "I'm going to reach for my phone," she said carefully to the officer watching her. "I want to call our parents." "Put your hands back where I can see them," the officer snapped, stepping closer. But Amara had already managed to press the emergency contact button. Her phone was now recording and sending their location to their parents. "We haven't done anything wrong," David said, his voice steady despite the fear building inside him. "We're just trying to get home from our debate tournament." The first officer circled the car again, shining his flashlight into the back seat. "What's in that bag?" "My debate notes and our snacks," David answered. "You can look if you want to." From across the street, Mrs. Chen, their neighbor who taught at the local elementary school, walked over slowly. Several other neighbors followed, maintaining a respectful distance but making their presence known. "Is everything all right, officers?" Mrs. Chen asked calmly. "These are the senator's kids. They live just down the block." The second officer turned to her. "Ma'am, please step back. This is police business." "We're just concerned," another neighbor said. He was a retired postal worker who had lived in the neighborhood for 40 years. "These children have never been in any trouble." The crowd grew, not threatening but watchful. Someone was live streaming now. Others were making phone calls. The community had formed a protective circle around the teenagers without a single threatening word or gesture. Amara noticed one of the officers checking his radio with growing frequency. She could see the uncertainty in his eyes as he scanned the growing crowd of witnesses. "Officer Taylor," she heard someone say, reading the name badge. "My uncle works with you at the precinct. He's Officer Powell. Should I call him?" The officers exchanged glances. The situation was slipping out of their control, not through confrontation, but through calm, determined community presence. David's phone buzzed in his pocket. "Sir, may I check my phone? That's probably my father." The officer nodded reluctantly. David read the text message. "We're 3 minutes away. Stay calm. You're doing everything right." Meanwhile, the second officer had finished searching the car and found nothing but school supplies, snacks, and their debate materials. He closed the door with a little more force than necessary. "So why did you stop us?" Amara asked, gathering courage from the supportive faces around them. "We weren't speeding. Our taillights work. We didn't run any stop signs." The first officer cleared his throat. "We received a report of suspicious activity in the area. A car matching this description. A silver Honda sedan." Mrs. Chen asked skeptically. "Like half the cars in this neighborhood." The crowd murmured in agreement. Someone called out, "My daughter has the same car. Did you stop her too when she drove through earlier?" Just then, headlights turned onto the street and a black SUV pulled up behind the police cruiser. 2 people stepped out. A distinguished-looking man in a casual sweater and jeans, and a woman in a simple blouse and pants. The senator and his wife had arrived. Instead of rushing forward in anger, they approached with dignified calm. The crowd parted respectfully. "Good evening, officers," the senator said, his voice carrying across the now quiet street. "I'm Senator Williams, and this is my wife, Dr. Williams. These are our children. May I ask what's happening here?" The officers straightened their postures, suddenly aware of whose children they had detained and how many witnesses were present. "Sir, we were responding to a call about suspicious activity," the first officer explained, his tone now professionally neutral. The senator nodded thoughtfully, his eyes taking in the scene, his children standing beside their searched car, their belongings spread across the hood, the neighbors gathered in silent support. "I see," he said simply. What he did next would surprise everyone, especially the officers who had targeted his children. The entire street fell silent as Senator Williams stood face to face with the officers who had detained his children. The tension in the air was almost visible, like heat rising from hot pavement. Everyone expected anger, accusations, maybe even threats about consequences and lawsuits. That's how these stories usually went. But the senator did something unexpected. He took a deep breath, looked at his children to make sure they were okay, and then turned back to the officers with calm determination in his eyes. "Officers, I'd like to talk with you," he said, his voice steady and measured. Not as a senator, but as a father. He gestured toward his parked car. "Would you mind stepping away from the crowd for a moment? My wife will stay with our children." The officers exchanged confused glances. This wasn't the reaction they had prepared for. After a moment's hesitation, they nodded and followed the senator a short distance away, still within sight of everyone but out of earshot. Meanwhile, Dr. Williams wrapped her arms around David and Amara. "Are you two all right?" she asked, checking them over with a mother's careful eyes. "We're fine, Mom," David assured her, though his shoulders finally relaxed for the first time since the police lights had flashed in his mirror. "We did everything Dad taught us." Mrs. Chen approached Dr. Williams. "We were watching the whole time," she said. "These officers had no reason to stop them." "Thank you for being here," Dr. Williams replied, looking around at the gathered neighbors. "Thank you all for watching out for my children." Across the street, something remarkable was happening. Instead of pointing fingers or raising his voice, the senator was talking to the officers with his hands open, his posture relaxed but dignified. He was speaking, then listening, then speaking again. One of the officers, the younger one who had searched the car, shifted his weight uncomfortably, then nodded at something the senator said. The older officer removed his hat and ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that somehow made him look more human, less like an authority figure, and more like a person caught in a difficult situation. "What do you think Dad is saying to them?" Amara whispered to her brother. "I don't know," David replied, "but whatever it is, they're listening." The crowd of neighbors stayed put, a silent witness to whatever was unfolding. Some had their phones out, still recording. Others simply stood with arms crossed, watching. No one left. This moment felt important, like something they needed to see through to the end. After about 10 minutes, the senator and the officers walked back toward the car. The change in the officer's demeanor was striking. There was no more aggression, no more suspicion. Instead, there was something that looked almost like respect. "David, Amara," the senator said, "Officer Rodriguez and Officer Bennett would like to speak with you." The older officer stepped forward first. "I want to apologize for the way we handled this situation," he said, his voice gruff but sincere. "We received a call about a suspicious vehicle, but that's no excuse for how we treated you." The younger officer nodded. "We made assumptions we shouldn't have made," he added. "Your father helped us understand some things. I'm sorry we put you through this." The crowd murmured in surprise. Police apologies weren't common in their experience. Then the senator addressed the gathered neighbors. "Thank you all for looking out for my children tonight," he said. "This is what community means, standing together, watching out for each other." He turned back to the officers. "And I'd like to invite Officers Rodriguez and Bennett to join us next week for the community dinner at the recreation center. I think there's a conversation that needs to happen, not just about tonight, but about how we move forward together." The older officer looked surprised, but nodded. "We'll be there, Senator." As the crowd began to disperse and the police prepared to leave, Mrs. Chen approached the senator. "What did you say to them?" she asked quietly. "I've never seen officers change their attitude like that." The senator smiled slightly. "I just reminded them that underneath our uniforms and titles, we're all fathers worried about our children coming home safe at night." He paused. "And I invited them to help find a better way forward." No one knew it yet, but that night would be the beginning of something that would change their entire community. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood about what had happened that night. By morning, phone videos of the incident had been shared hundreds of times. Local news vans parked along the street, reporters hoping to interview the senator's family or anyone who had witnessed the event. The senator's phone rang nonstop. Political allies urged him to use the moment to push for new legislation. Activists wanted him to lead a protest. Opponents were already spinning stories about playing the victim. Everyone wanted something from him. But the senator had other ideas. A week later, the community center buzzed with nervous energy. Tables were set up in a large circle rather than rows. People entered cautiously, choosing seats beside those they knew. The Williams family arrived early, greeting everyone who walked through the door. "I wasn't sure if I should come," Mrs. Chen whispered to Dr. Williams as she helped arrange water pitchers on the tables. "Will those officers really show up?" As if on cue, the door opened and Officers Rodriguez and Bennett walked in. They weren't in uniform, just regular clothes like everyone else. The room fell silent. Some people crossed their arms. Others whispered to their neighbors. The tension was thick enough to touch. David and Amara watched from near the refreshment table, wondering what would happen next. "Thank you all for coming," the senator said, stepping to the center of the room. "This isn't a town hall or a formal meeting. It's just dinner. A chance for us to talk to each other instead of about each other." He gestured to the officers. "Some of you might be surprised to see Officers Rodriguez and Bennett here. They didn't have to come. It would have been easier not to. But they chose to be here, and I respect that courage. Officer Bennett looked down at his hands. Officer Rodriguez nodded slightly, his face unreadable. Before we eat, I'd like to ask my son to share his experience from that night, the senator continued. Not to blame anyone, but because we can't solve problems we don't understand. David stepped forward, clearing his throat nervously. He spoke simply about what it felt like to be pulled over, to be treated like a criminal, to fear for his sister's safety despite having done nothing wrong. The worst part wasn't being stopped, he said quietly. It was knowing that if our neighbors hadn't come outside, if my parents hadn't showed up, if we didn't have the last name we have, things might have ended very differently. When he finished, the room was silent. Then Officer Rodriguez stood up. I've been a police officer for 12 years, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I became a cop because I wanted to help people. But somewhere along the way, he paused, choosing his words carefully. Somewhere along the way, I started seeing threats instead of people. He looked directly at David. When I pulled you over that night, I didn't see a debate champion heading home. I saw a profile, a stereotype. The senator helped me see that. Officer Bennett spoke next. 2 months ago, my son got pulled over in the next county over, he admitted. He's 16, just got his license. The officer made him get out of the car, questioned him for nearly an hour because he looked suspicious. My son is mixed race. He shook his head. I was furious when he told me, but I never connected it to how I treat people when I'm in uniform until last week. Slowly, other people began to share their stories. A high school teacher talked about her fear when her teenage son started driving. A retired bus driver described being stopped 14 times in 1 year without ever receiving a ticket. A young mother explained how she taught her 5-year-old son what to do if a police officer ever approached him. As people spoke, something shifted in the room. The invisible walls between us and them didn't exactly come down, but doorways appeared. People nodded in recognition of shared experiences. They passed dishes of food to one another. They actually listened. Amara leaned toward her brother. Dad didn't organize a protest or call a press conference, she whispered. He just got people in the same room to be together. David nodded. Sometimes the bravest thing isn't standing up to power, he said. It's sitting down together when it would be easier to walk away. No one knew it then, but this dinner was just the beginning of a remarkable journey for their community. The community dinner wasn't just a one-time event. Over the next month, something unexpected began to grow from that first uncomfortable gathering. What started as a tense evening of hesitant conversation turned into weekly meetings at the community center. Each week, more people showed up. I never thought I'd see this, Mrs. Chen said one evening as she watched Officer Rodriguez helping a group of teenagers set up chairs. If you told me a month ago that I'd be working side by side with the same officers who pulled over your kids, I would have said you were dreaming. The senator smiled. Sometimes the most powerful changes start with the smallest steps. After the third community dinner, Officer Bennett approached David as he was helping clean up. My son wants to meet you, he said, looking slightly uncomfortable. He's thinking about joining the debate team at his school. I told him you won states. David looked surprised. Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to talk with him about debate. The following week, Officer Bennett brought his son Tyler to the community center. The 16-year-old was quiet at first, hanging back near the door while his father greeted people. David walked over. You must be Tyler, he said, holding out his hand. Your dad says you're interested in debate. Tyler nodded. I've never done it before, but it looks interesting. Dad says you're really good. I could show you some basics if you want, David offered. Amara and I practice in the back room sometimes before these meetings. As the adults continued their discussions in the main room, David, Amara, and Tyler sat in a circle in the small back office. What started as a simple debate lesson turned into a deeper conversation. After you guys got pulled over, my dad came home different, Tyler said quietly. He sat me down and asked about the time I got stopped by that cop last summer. He never wanted to talk about it before. Amara raised her eyebrows. What changed? Tyler shrugged. He said your dad helped him see things differently. Now he's talking about starting some kind of youth program with the police department. Meanwhile, in the main room, Officer Rodriguez was speaking to the group. Gone was the defensive stance and guarded expression from the first meeting. Now he leaned forward in his chair, speaking with passion. "Look, we can't change everything overnight," he said, "but we've started something here. Next week, the chief wants to come to our meeting. He's been hearing about what we're doing, and he's interested." Mrs. Chen looked skeptical. Interested in real change or interested in good publicity? Officer Rodriguez nodded, acknowledging her concern. "That's a fair question. I can't speak for him. But I can tell you that things are already changing at the station. Officers are talking differently. We're questioning each other when someone makes an assumption based on how someone looks." "Words are easy," someone called from the back of the room. "We need action." The senator stood up. "You're absolutely right," he said, "which is why I've been working with Officers Rodriguez and Bennett on a proposal. We want to create a community oversight committee, real people from this neighborhood who will have a voice in police training, in reviewing complaints, in making sure that what happened to my children doesn't happen to anyone else." Dr. Williams, who had been quiet during most of these meetings, spoke up. "As a doctor, I know that healing doesn't happen all at once. It takes time, consistent effort, and trust. What I've seen in this room over the past month is the beginning of healing." Later that evening, as they drove home, Amara looked out the window at the familiar streets of their neighborhood. "Do you think anything will really change?" she asked her parents. "Beyond just our community, I mean." The senator was quiet for a moment. "Change ripples outward," he finally said. "The chief coming to our next meeting, that's a ripple. Tyler and Officer Bennett talking honestly with each other, that's a ripple. We can't change the whole world at once, but we can create enough ripples that eventually they become a wave." What none of them realized yet was just how far those ripples would reach and how many lives would be transformed by what had begun as a frightening traffic stop on an ordinary evening. 3 months after that first community dinner, the small meeting room couldn't hold everyone anymore. They had to move to the main hall of the community center with folding chairs set up in concentric circles. People from neighboring towns started showing up, curious about the program that was making waves in local news. The police chief, a stern-faced man named Chief Thomas, had become a regular attendee. At first, he sat quietly in the back, arms crossed, expression unreadable. But over weeks, something changed. He began to participate, asking questions, listening more than talking. On this particular evening, something special was happening. Local news cameras were set up in the corner of the room. The mayor sat in the front row, checking her watch and straightening her jacket. "Are you nervous?" Amara asked David as they helped distribute handouts to the chairs. David shrugged. "A little, but it's a good kind of nervous, you know. Like before a debate competition." Their father was deep in conversation with Officers Rodriguez and Bennett near the podium. All 3 men looked serious but determined. "It's time," Dr. Williams called, gesturing for everyone to take their seats. The room fell quiet as the senator approached the microphone. He looked around at the gathered faces, neighbors, officers, city officials, and many others who had joined their growing movement. 6 months ago, he began, my children were driving home from a debate tournament when they were pulled over and treated like criminals for no reason except how they looked. That night could have gone in many different directions. He paused, making eye contact with Officers Rodriguez and Bennett, who nodded in acknowledgement. Instead of anger and division, we chose conversation. Instead of pointing fingers, we decided to join hands. And today, I'm proud to announce that the City Council has unanimously approved our proposal for the Community Safety Partnership. Applause broke out across the room. Mrs. Chen wiped tears from her eyes. Tyler, who now sat with David and Amara at every meeting, pumped his fist in the air. Chief Thomas stepped up to the microphone next. When Officer Rodriguez first told me about these meetings, I'll be honest, I thought it was just talk. Another community relations stunt that would fizzle out in a few weeks. He cleared his throat. I've never been happier to be wrong. He explained the details of the new partnership. A civilian oversight committee with real authority. New training programs developed with community input. Youth mentorship opportunities connecting teens with officers, and body cameras for every officer with footage accessible to the Oversight Committee. This isn't just about policies, the chief continued. It's about people. It's about seeing each other as human beings first. Officer Bennett took the microphone next, his normally gruff voice soft with emotion. My son Tyler and I have had more real conversations in the past 3 months than in his whole life. He told me things I needed to hear. About how he feels when he sees a police car in his rearview mirror. About how he has to think twice about what he wears or where he goes. He looked directly at David and Amara. What happened to you two that night was wrong. But from that wrong, we're building something right. The mayor spoke next about expanding the program citywide, followed by community members sharing their experiences with the new approach to policing that was already being tested in their neighborhood. As the formal part of the evening wrapped up and people broke into smaller discussion groups, a reporter approached David. You and your sister were at the center of all this, she said. How does it feel to see what's grown from that night? David thought for a moment, looking around at the room full of people talking earnestly across what used to be uncrossable divides. Officers and civilians, young and old, people of all backgrounds finding common ground. It feels like what my dad always told us, he finally answered. That real change doesn't come from fighting against something. It comes from building something better together. Outside the community center, a small crowd of people from a neighboring city had gathered, holding signs. We want the community safety partnership too. The ripples were becoming waves, just as the senator had predicted. And no one, not even he, could have imagined how far those waves would eventually reach. 1 year later, the Williams family stood in the back of a crowded auditorium at the state capitol. Hundreds of people filled the seats, with more standing along the walls. On stage, the governor was about to sign the Community Safety Act into law. Can you believe this all started with us getting pulled over? Amara whispered to her brother. David shook his head. I still think about that night sometimes. How scared we were. How differently it could have ended. Their mother squeezed both their shoulders. Look what you two helped start, she said proudly. On stage, the governor stood at the podium, flanked by state legislators, police officials, and community leaders. Among them were Officer Rodriguez and Chief Thomas, both looking slightly uncomfortable in formal suits instead of their usual uniforms. Today marks a historic step forward, the governor announced. This legislation, which will reform police training and accountability across our entire state, began as a grassroots effort in a single neighborhood. She gestured toward the Williams family in the back. A single incident that could have divided a community instead united it. The crowd applauded as cameras turned toward the family. The senator nodded in acknowledgement but stayed where he was, letting the spotlight remain on those on stage. After the ceremony, people gathered in small groups, shaking hands and taking photos. Mrs. Chen, who had traveled to the Capitol with several other neighbors, dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. I never thought I'd live to see this day, she told Dr. Williams. Real change, not just promises. Tyler, now a confident high school senior, approached David and Amara with a group of other teens. Over the past year, they had formed a youth council that advised the Community Safety Partnership. We just got approved to take our program to 5 more high schools next semester, Tyler announced, excitement clear in his voice. Students working directly with officers, having the hard conversations, creating change together. David high-fived him. That's incredible. You're going to be busy. Worth it, Tyler replied. My dad says he barely recognizes the department anymore. Officers actually talk about race now, about bias. They question each other when they see something wrong. Officer Bennett joined them, now wearing the insignia of a sergeant. The old-timers like me had the most to unlearn, he admitted. But when you know better, you do better. He looked at his son with undisguised pride. Tyler's generation is going to transform policing in ways we can't even imagine. Across the room, Officer Rodriguez was speaking with a group of officers from other cities. It's not easy, they overheard him saying. There were plenty of officers who pushed back, who said we were betraying the badge. Some still do. But more and more are seeing that this makes everyone safer, communities and officers. As the crowd began to thin, a young reporter approached the senator. Your colleagues are calling you the architect of the most significant police reform in state history, she said, holding up her recorder. How does that feel? The senator smiled and shook his head. I'm not the architect. No single person is. This was built by hundreds of people choosing conversation over confrontation, understanding over accusation. Officers willing to listen. Communities willing to engage, young people like my children and their friends pushing us all to do better. Later that evening, the Williams family walked together through the Capitol grounds, taking a moment of quiet after the busy day. When I was running for office, the senator said, I promised to change things. I thought that meant fighting battles, winning arguments. He looked at his children. You two taught me the most important lesson about making real change. What's that? Amara asked. That the longest-lasting changes don't come from defeating enemies. They come from turning them into allies. David stopped walking and looked back at the Capitol building, golden in the setting sun. You know what I keep thinking about? That night, when you came to help us after we got pulled over. You could have yelled, threatened, made demands. The senator nodded. Many people would have. I was tempted to. But you didn't, David continued. You saw Officers Rodriguez and Bennett as people first. That changed everything. As they continued walking, Dr. Williams linked arms with her children. The work isn't finished, she reminded them. It never really will be. But look how far we've come, Amara said, from one scary traffic stop to changing the law. The senator smiled at his family. That's how transformation happens. Not all at once, but step by step, conversation by conversation, person by person. And it starts with seeing the humanity in each other, even in the hardest moments. As the sun set behind them, they walked together toward home, knowing that their story had become part of something much larger than themselves, a blueprint for turning pain into progress and division into unity.